Human rights are the rights you have simply because you're human. It's how you instinctively expect and deserve to be treated as a person, like the right to live freely, to speak your mind, and to be treated as an equal. There are many kinds of rights. Most apply to a certain group. But human rights are the only ones that apply to absolutely everyone, everywhere. That means kids, old people, poor people, basketball players, garbage men, rappers, teachers, Africans, Indians, Albanians, Christians, Muslims, Kabbalists, atheists, your mom, your dad, your next door neighbor, and you all have the exact same human rights.
Κυρίες και κύριοι, γεια σας. Σήμερα συναντούμε τον Σέφας Λουμίνα, νομικό με ειδικότητα στα ανθρώπινα δικαιώματα. Μέχρι πρόσφατα ειδικό εισηγητή του ΟΗΕ για τις επιπτώσεις του εξωτερικού χρέους στα ανθρώπινα δικαιώματα. Mr. Lumina, good afternoon. Hello to you too.
Good afternoon.
Was your life's path defined by the fact that you've born in Africa and, the atmosphere of apartheid and the violation of human rights there?
To a certain extent, yes. I was born, as you know, in Zambia, in a region that was characterized by colonial rule. And my country was surrounded by a number of countries that were still under racist rule and apartheid. Here I'm referring to Angola, Mozambique, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. In that context, it was very difficult not to develop a sense of outrage at the kind of injustices that the people in the region were suffering.
When did you first realize that you want to study human rights law?
In the late 80s, in the post-independence period in my country for a number of years, I think close to 19, we were under a one-party system of government which did not allow any kind of political dissent. And as one grew up in that particular environment, one could not help but feel a sense of injustice. And so it was towards the end of the 80s that I decided that I wanted to specialize in human rights, and I went to the United Kingdom to pursue a master's degree in human rights.
You are also teaching human rights law at the University of Petrolia and at the Land University. As a professor, you have noticed an increased interest of people towards human rights these days?
Yes, certainly. I mean, there's an increasing number of people that are interested in studying human rights. I think this is a reflection of the very volatile, global economic,
globalization,
global environment in which we live. I mean, there's conflict everywhere. There's, deprivation, poverty, inequality, and people are realizing that human rights can play a critical role in addressing those particular challenges. So yes, there is an increase of interest by people in studying human rights.
You've worked with the UN. Which was your first case?
The very first mission that I undertook as an independent expert of the United Nations was in 2008, the year that I was appointed, and this was a mission to the World Bank, the IMF, to the Paris Club, to the Belgian Ministry of Finance, and to the UK Department of International Development. I wanted to understand the context in which some of these policies are formulated.
You've also conducted a report on Greece. Were there any special characteristics concerning our features?
Not quite. I mean, the hardships that have been brought on Greek society through the implementation of the Troika's bailout program, so to speak, is nothing new. This is a reality, or has been the reality of life for many countries, but many countries in the South. Of course, we have witnessed in recent years that a number of European countries have been going through similar problems. And so in the context of my visit to Greece, I noticed that much of the hardship that I'd witnessed in other parts of the world was exactly the same that the Greek people were witnessing. But of course, what was different is that, Greek is a developed country, and this is the first time that you're seeing this kind of problem or this kind of impact on the population. There are a number of things that struck me the most when I visited Greece. And here I'm saying so in the context that Greece is a developed country. I couldn't help but notice, the very serious levels of deprivation that the people were being subjected to. You are conditioned by the environment in which you live. You are used to certain things. You are used to good quality health care. But all of a sudden that disappears because of the impact of these particular policies. So yes, that to me, was quite shocking.
It was as if progress was reversed here in Greece.
Certainly, it's true. I mean, my own assessment is that the bailout program has had very, very serious negative consequences for the population of Greece. Not only in terms of the economy, going into recession for a number of years, people losing jobs, but also social costs, lack of access to quality health care, people losing their jobs, people losing their pensions. Essentially, people's standards of living, getting lower and lower. So that to me was a significant reversal on the gains that the country had made in terms of the standards of living of the people.
Not to mention those who lived or didn't even survive the extreme poverty they were forced into.
Yes, certainly. I mean, that is another visible consequence of the bailout program. There's an increase in levels of poverty. I'm sure you've looked at my report where indicate that at the time that I visited, approximately 10% of the Greek population were living in extreme poverty. And with poverty, comes inequality. There's a gap between the rich and the poor.
To which other countries, European and in other parts of the world, have you conducted similar studies?
In Europe, I've been to Latvia. You probably know that Latvia implemented a similar program that was put together by the World Bank, IMF, the European Commission, and several European countries. Outside Europe, I've been to the Solomon Islands in the Asia-Pacific region. It's a very small country. I've been to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, been to Ecuador, to Argentina. I've also, tried to visit other countries that really are not in the position that Greece or these other countries I've mentioned are. But they were of interest to me because the policies that they have in the context of the international relations have implications for the economic policies in other countries. So in that context, I visited Norway, I visited Australia and Japan. I forgot to mention I visited Vietnam as well.
All over the world.
Yes.
You've been almost. The policies are the same concerning economic adjustment system. I mean, the measures taken within Europe or in other countries, can we say that they are the same, the approach?
Exactly the same. Mm-hmm. This is the worrying factor. What you're seeing in Greece, in other European countries, in the context of the so-called bailout programs, the policies there are exactly the same policies that the IMF and World Bank impose on countries of the South, in Africa, in Latin America. Typically, structure adjustment, meaning basically you have to privatize or sell off the state-owned enterprises. You have to cut public spending. You have to introduce fees for the use of public services. You have to implement labor reforms. The template is exactly the same.
Economic adjustment systems turn out to violate human rights. If this is a legal pretext in order to violate human rights, are they using any other alibis?
Well, there are other channels, I mean, of course, outside the adjustment programs that have implications for human rights. Remember, we live in a state of globalization where our economies are linked. And so there are other channels such as loose controls on the movement of capital across borders, which results in illicit financial outflows, which obviously have implications for the capacity of states to fulfill their obligations to the people. You can also talk about international trade rules, which basically, are skewed in favor of the more powerful countries. So there are various channels that, these effects can be felt.
Of course, the fact that the markets are invisible and they act from all over the world, so you can't control.
Exactly. It's precisely the lack of transparency in the global financial and economic system that is behind all of these problems that we are facing now.
Is the presence of the Chapter 472, Article 7, Paragraph 9, helping you in comparison to other countries?
Well, certainly. I mean, it's a very clear indication that the European Union recognizes the need for countries to take measures to obtain a comprehensive picture of their debt situation. But to me, that is just a bonus in the sense that throughout my work as United Nations independent expert, I've always recommended that countries should be accountable and transparent in their dealings in relation to foreign debt by, amongst other things, conducting periodic and transparent audits.
From the start of our lives, because we are human beings, there are certain things our governments must do to help us reach our potential. These expectations and claims we have of our governments are called human rights. Every single man, woman and child has them. Rights call on governments to respect, avoid putting limits on some things that a person can do. Protect, safeguard a person from abuse. Fulfill, to provide basic conditions to enable a person to achieve their potential. The most basic minimum human rights standards have been discussed and written down by countries. Countries have agreed to follow them. These have become international law. An example where human rights can be found at home is in the Constitution. Promoting respect for basic rights is one of the main purposes of the United Nations. This is achieved through activities of United Nations organisations around the world. The Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights is responsible for leading the UN's Human Rights Programme. There are also committees of experts that monitor how well countries put their human rights promises into practice. And there is an assembly of countries called the Human Rights Council, which discusses different human rights topics and situations from around the world.
Which is the present situation of Greece towards human rights compared to other European countries?
Well, certainly Greece and the other countries that have, been going through the crisis, the enjoyment of human rights in those countries has been severely undermined in relation to other European countries that have not suffered the same, degree of crisis.
Do you think that solidarity is one of the basic losses of New Age societies?
Certainly. I think that, societies need to engage in a higher level of solidarity if you're to fight, the power of the markets. These are, faceless entities that are very, very powerful and they control the destinies of people. The only way that you can fight them is to have a high degree of solidarity.
So this may be a kind of a gain. At the end, we may find again one another.
Yes, precisely. I mean, out of obviously the misery that people have gone through has come a keen awareness of the need for people to, stand together to fight this kind of economic oppression.
Noam Chomsky, several decades ago, has marked the fact that people are alone and they are alone consumers in their houses enclosed. This also cultivates a certain egoism. This egoism, in which ways made the situation more easy for those who want to manipulate us?
I can put it in a very different way. I wouldn't speak about it being a question of ego. It's much more a question of greed, accumulation at the expense of other people. And this, to my view, is what shapes the neoliberal economic policies that are being pushed, onto people all over the world with the disastrous results that we've seen.
If we say that this is an economic war, in this war is used a psychological term, the guilt term. You are to blame because you are in this situation.
It's not very helpful. It's very harmful in my view. And sadly, in a situation where countries find themselves in some kind of financial distress, this is typically a tool that is used, to blame the countries that are in distress, that they are responsible for their own mess, to the exclusion of an examination of the role of external actors. As you rightly pointed, there is a core group of people that are preoccupied with accumulating as much wealth as they can at the expense of other people. You have a situation where, for example, banks will lend in a reckless fashion. Banks or countries, for that matter, will lend to other countries, to buy goods that don't benefit the population. And in that particular context, there's an element of corruption. But when the crisis erupts in the country that borrowed, there is no examination of this element of bribery or corruption on the part of the lenders. The blame is shifted to those that borrowed. For example, in the case of Greece, I've heard remarks that Greece finds itself in the situation it is because, the government is corrupt, the Greek people are lazy, which is not true. So it is really unfortunate, and it sort of shifts the blame to those that do not actually deserve to have the blame.
It's like they shift the blame from the states towards the people. In other sectors also, in education, you are responsible for your own education and you are responsible for your own success. So the state is less and less responsible for you, and how this is in contrast with the basic European and human values and rights.
It's totally inconsistent with it. Remember, when you look at the evolution of the state exists to protect the interests and welfare of the people.
Education, health, etc.
Exactly. So you can't have a situation where increasingly the state is disavowing its responsibilities towards the people and saying you are responsible for this and that.
In cases of economic crisis like ours, which are the fields that are affected first?
It's difficult to say, but I can point out the main ones. These include the areas of health, access to health care, access to education, the rights to work or access to employment opportunities. Of course, there's an increase in poverty because of, people no longer have an income. Housing is in the case of Greece. Housing, I think, is one of the sectors that has been seriously affected.
As an independent expert for the UN, have you ever been personally affected, emotionally affected?
As an independent expert of the United Nations, I was required to be impartial and to be objective in order to make a report that was, independent and impartial in its outlook. But there are occasions that, when you visit these countries, you cannot help but, feel a great sense of sorrow, at the misery that you see. For example, when I visited Greece, one of my first experiences was to learn about a person that had booked into a hotel that I was staying in, that jumped out, the window on the 6th floor of the hotel to their death, and they left a suicide note indicating that they couldn't cope with life anymore. I mean, as a human being, obviously, that is something that would affect you. But as I say, on mission as a human expert, you try to be objective.
Is there a reason, Mr. Lουμίνα, that you are working with the UN, all the experts, for a certain period of time, for 6 years?
Yes, as a special procedures mandate holder of the United Nations Human Rights Council, we are limited to 2 terms of 3 years each. I was appointed in 2008, and my term came to an end in 2014. Obviously, I mean, my experience in that position was such that I would have liked to do more, to continue if possible, to try and help, the people that don't have the voice to speak out for their rights. But unfortunately, we are limited to a term of 6 years.
Have you conducted the experts working for the UN and elsewhere any researches about the rise of suicides and the relation towards the economic crisis?
Yes, certainly. There are many studies that have been conducted that demonstrate a clear link between the sharp increase in suicides in countries such as Greece, even Spain, Portugal, that have gone through crisis. But speaking about Greece, if you look at the report that I presented to the Human Rights Council after my mission to Greece, I indicated that my assessment of the studies that I'd done indicated that there had been, since 2009 to 2013, an increase of about 37% in the number of suicides. And of course, a number of these, according to the information I received, are not reported. So the number might actually be higher.
I've read your report, actually. That's why I've mentioned it. And I want also to notice that you say, we suggest, we recommend, we welcome, we urge. Would you ever wish that the UN could do more? Where do we lose all this valuable information and assessments?
Unfortunately, maybe to answer that particular question, it will be useful to say a little bit how the UN works in the area of human rights. There are 3 main mechanisms through which the UN helps countries to fulfill their human rights obligations. One of these is what is called the Universal Periodic Review, which is a mechanism of the Human Rights Council, where every certain number of years, each of the member states of the UN is assessed by its fellow member states on its human rights performance, and recommendations are made to it on how to improve its human rights performance. The second mechanism is the treaty bodies, but this one is limited in scope in the sense that the committee of experts, which each of the main United Nations treaties establishes, has the competence only to examine the human rights performance of the countries that have ratified or that are parties to that particular instrument. But again, they are not a judicial body. They do not have powers of enforcement. They can only make recommendations to the state concerned. The third one is the special procedures, of which I was one. And again, we're limited to making recommendations both to the Council, to the countries concerned, and in the case of Greece, to the international lenders as well. The idea is that they must take human rights standards into account in the way that they go about their business. For example, in the case of Greece, one of my recommendations was that international lenders should take full account of Greece's obligations towards its people in crafting that bailout program, which unfortunately does not seem to have been the case. So, in summary, whilst the United Nations does the best that it possibly can, to monitor the situation, to assess the situation, and to make recommendations. At the end of the day, it is up to the individual country concerned to take up those recommendations and to implement them.
Which social groups are affected the most by the economic crisis, according to your report?
The most vulnerable. And here I'm referring to elderly people, pensioners, people with disabilities, women. In the context of Greece, I think women were affected the most in terms of losing employment, young people, migrants. So essentially vulnerable sectors of the population.
Given the fact that you are doing the best in the UN to help the countries that are deprived from their rights, why we are still losing rights?
I think you need to understand that it is the states that have the primary obligation to fulfill the human rights of their populations. So whilst the United Nations can do the best that it can, and for that matter, even the European Union institutions can do their best to help countries, at the end of the day, it's for the government of that particular country to ensure that the recommendations that are made are implemented. But I also should mention that in the context of the United Nations, there is an obligation on the member states of the United Nations to cooperate with the United Nations in fulfilling the purposes of the United Nations, which includes the promotion and protection of human rights. So it is a duty under the UN Charter. It is unfortunate that in practice, many states choose to ignore that particular duty to cooperate with the United Nations.
But Mr. Lomina, there is a contradiction there. Taking our case, we are to pay and be responsible and be true to our obligations, even if they violate our rights, and we've signed that. Previous governments signed that.
I take the contrary view. You see, my own assessment is that the obligation to repay loans, for example, sovereign loans, whilst it must be honored, it's not absolute. So it is subject, for example, to the obligation of the state to fulfill its primary obligations towards the people. So it is necessary, I think, when a state is entering into these sorts of agreements, to bear in mind always its obligations to provide for the welfare and to fulfill the human rights obligations to the human rights of its population when it is, signing onto these, kind of memoranda or programs.
Wars, Mr. Lumina, were always conducted in the name of redistributing wealth. So this is the case again of redistribution of wealth.
I agree. I mean, these kinds of policies that are being implemented, I think, are pushing us perilously close to a situation where people cannot take, anymore. And I'm not suggesting that there should be agitation, but, people's patience at some stage wears thin, and they become concerned about the unequal distribution of resources. And unfortunately, this is one of the side effects or consequences of the kind of policies that we are seeing now.
Does wealth end up to the hands of the few?
Yeah, as I mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, one of the unfortunate consequences of the bailout program has been an increase in the gap between the rich and the poor. In other words, an increase in poverty and inequality. And I'm referring to the widening gap between those that have money or those that have resources and the majority that do not have. So increasingly, we are witnessing a situation where these crises tend to create a situation where wealth is accumulated by a few at the expense of the majority.
Which brings us to the beginning of this interview, when you mentioned greediness.
Yes, it's greed. It's basic greed. It's a question of social and economic justice, but we're not that is totally under threat, and it's not a situation that is confined to Greece. Unfortunately, it's a global phenomenon. If my memory serves me right, I think less than 2% of the world's population control the global wealth.
Globalization in this way didn't work in the favor of the vulnerable.
It has been a disaster.
So what is your suggestion?
We need to go back to basics. We need to rethink the entire global economic system. We need to address a number of things. For example, increasing transparency in the banking system, increasing transparency in relation to that taxation. I mentioned that very few people own the world's wealth, but at the same time, it's these very few people that are taxed the least. It's the ordinary person that are taxed in a myriad of ways. I'm not talking about pay as you earn, because in the present moment, most people do not even have to pay income tax because they're unemployed, but they have to pay regressive taxes such as VAT on goods and services, without which they cannot live. So they end up paying more to sustain the lavish styles of the rich and powerful. We need to tackle the question of secrecy in terms of, company holdings. A number of companies that are involved in the financial markets are based in tax havens, where they are not required to disclose who owns them, how they do their business, what profits they make, what taxes they make. We need to address all of that.
You are a member of the Parliament's committee about the truth concerning our external debt.
Okay, first I want to make a general comment, and I want to go back to the report that I made when I visited Greece. One of the key recommendations was precisely that the government of Greece should conduct a transparent audit of the country's debt. And I made that particular recommendation based on the firm belief that the government should be accountable to its population for how it enters into loan agreements with the external actors, because at the end of the day, it's the people that must pay back that money. For me, the initiative by the Parliament of Greece is long overdue. It is very welcome. I'm glad, from the initial sessions to note that, the government is fully supportive of the initiative. I think we had the President of the Republic and several, senior government officials.
The Prime Minister?
The Prime Minister, senior government officials, the ministers, and the heads of various, government bodies come to speak out in favor of such an audit. I'm also gratified to note that there is an enthusiastic team, both of international and local experts, that I think are motivated more by the quest, to achieve social and economic justice for the Greek people rather than anything else. And so I'm optimistic that the committee will be able to do the best job that it can do to present an independent and comprehensive report that will show to the Greek population the circumstances in which the debt which they're required to pay was actually incurred, and whether and to what extent they are required to repay portions of that debt.
Mr. Lουμίνα, thank you very much for being here, for helping us, having declined your fee, because during the past years we used to pay high fees, not for our best interest.
Well, thank you for having me, and I want to thank the President of the Parliament of Greece for the honor bestowed upon me, to invite me to participate in what I think is a noble cause. Anyone that has a vision for contributing to what is envisaged in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 28, which says that everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights set forth in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights can be fully realized, I think would share the view that it is a moral imperative for us to help not only the Greek people, but everyone else around the world that has been, the victim of such, such policies. And so, for me, the question of the fee, and indeed for members of the committee in general, the question of the fee doesn't arise. I also want to mention that during the 6 years that I served with the United Nations, I was not paid any fee. So it's a pleasure to help.
You do good for nothing. You are working for a better world. And again, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Κυρίες και κύριοι, αυτή ήταν η συζήτηση με τον Σέφας Λουμίνα, ειδικό νομικό σε θέματα ανθρωπίνων δικαιωμάτων. Από μας, καλό σας βράδυ.